The cradle sat in the corner of the cabin, its hand-carved maple gleaming in the firelight. Each spindle had been shaped with infinite care, every joint fitted with the precision of a master craftsman. The wood still smelled of pine resin and beeswax, testament to hours of patient labor. But it remained empty, as it had for 3 months now, a monument to hope deferred and dreams that felt increasingly fragile with each passing day. Rachel Campbell stood before it, her fingers tracing the smooth rail that would have cradled a small head. The silence in the cabin felt profound, broken only by the crackling of burning logs and the distant howl of wind through the mountain peaks. Outside, November snow began to fall, each flake catching the amber light from the windows before disappearing into the darkness beyond. She had stood here countless times since Timothy Lee had finished the cradle, each visit a ritual of longing and remembrance. The mountain man emerged from the shadows near the hearth, his footsteps deliberate but soft on the wooden floor. Timothy had learned to move quietly around her grief, understanding that some sorrows required space to breathe. His weathered hands carried 2 steaming cups of pine needle tea, the steam rising like incense in the still air. He set one cup on the small table beside the cradle, the other he kept for himself, waiting. "The snow's coming heavy tonight," he said, his voice low and measured. It was not really about the weather, this observation. It was his way of offering presence without demanding response, of sharing the moment without intruding upon her private communion with loss. Rachel nodded, but still not turning from the cradle. Her reflection wavered in the dark window glass, a ghost of herself superimposed against the falling snow. "It'll be a hard winter," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The words carried more weight than mere meteorological prediction. Everything felt harder now, every season more challenging to endure. The cabin they shared had become a sanctuary, but it was also a place where memories lived in every corner. Timothy had built it with his own hands, each log selected and placed with the methodical patience that characterized everything he did. The walls were thick enough to keep out the mountain cold, the roof steep enough to shed the heavy snows that would soon bury the high country. But no amount of careful construction could keep out the ghosts that visited in the quiet hours. Timothy moved closer, not touching, but offering his presence like a steady flame. "The cradle's not going anywhere," he said gently. "When the time comes, it'll be ready." She finally turned to look at him, this man who had taken her in when her own family had cast her out like refuse. His face was weathered by wind and sun, marked by years of solitude in these mountains. But his eyes held a gentleness that still surprised her. When she had first stumbled into his clearing, broken and desperate, she had expected judgment. Instead, she had found acceptance. What if the time never comes? The question had haunted her for weeks, spoken now for the first time into the space between them. "What if I'm not meant for this?" Timothy set down his cup and moved to stand beside her at the cradle. His calloused fingers joined hers on the smooth rail, not claiming ownership but sharing the weight of hope. "The women in my family always said that wanting something too much could scare it away," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But they also said that love calls to love, across any distance. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments." The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling in ghostly patterns. Rachel closed her eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to believe in such things, to trust that love alone could bridge the gap between desire and fulfillment. 6 months ago, she had been a different woman entirely, living a different life in the valley below. 6 months ago, she had been married to Nicholas Cook, a man whose love had proven as shallow as his patience. The memory of that final morning still burned like a brand. She had woken to blood on the sheets and a pain that felt like her body was tearing itself apart. The baby she had carried for 4 months, the child they had planned for and dreamed about, was gone before the sun had fully risen. Nicholas had found her there, curled around her loss, and his face had gone white with something that looked more like disgust than grief. "You couldn't even do this right," he had said, his voice cold as winter stone. "My mother warned me you weren't strong enough for this." The words had cut deeper than the physical pain, deeper than the loss itself. In that moment, she had seen herself through his eyes. Defective, inadequate. a woman who couldn't fulfill the most basic expectation placed upon her. The shame had been overwhelming, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. The days that followed had blurred together in a haze of whispered conversations and sideways glances. Nicholas's family had made their position clear without ever speaking directly to her. His mother, Gloria Brown, had arrived that first afternoon with a basket of food and a mouthful of barely concealed recriminations. The older woman had bustled around the small house, cleaning things that were already clean, her movements sharp with disapproval. "These things happen for a reason," Gloria had said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never known such loss. "Perhaps it's the Lord's way of saying you are not ready for such responsibilities." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Rachel had wanted to scream, to rage against the casual cruelty of the words, but grief had stolen her voice. She had simply nodded and retreated further into herself, letting the older woman's judgment wash over her like cold rain. Nicholas had grown more distant with each passing day. He began taking his meals at his mother's house, returning home only to sleep. When he did speak to her, his words were clipped and formal, as if she were a stranger who had overstayed her welcome. The man who had once promised to love her through sickness and health, through joy and sorrow, had apparently never imagined that sorrow might take this particular shape. The breaking point had come 2 weeks after the miscarriage. Rachel had been sitting in their small garden, trying to find some peace among the late summer flowers, when she overheard Nicholas talking to his brother Benjamin on the front porch. Their voices carried clearly in the still evening air. "She's not the same woman I married," Nicholas was saying, his tone matter of fact. "It's like she's broken inside, and I don't know how to fix her. Maybe she can't be fixed." "Give her time," Benjamin had replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Women get strange ideas after something like this." "Time won't change the fact that she lost our child," Nicholas had said, and the casual way he assigned blame made Rachel's blood run cold. "What if it happens again? What if she can't carry a baby to term? I need sons, Benjamin. I need a wife who can give me sons." The conversation had continued, but Rachel had stopped listening. She had heard enough to understand her position in her husband's eyes. She was no longer a beloved wife who had suffered a tragedy. She was a defective broodmare who had failed to produce the desired offspring. The love she had thought was solid as mountain stone had revealed itself to be as fragile as spring ice. That night she had lain awake beside her sleeping husband and made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. She would leave. She had no money of her own, no family who would take her in after the shame of abandoning her marriage. But staying had become unthinkable. The house that had once felt like home now felt like a prison. Every room echoing with the ghost of the child she had lost and the love that had died with it. She had left before dawn, taking only what she could carry in a small canvas bag. Her wedding ring she left on the kitchen table beside a brief note explaining her decision. She had not asked for understanding or forgiveness. She had simply stated that she could no longer live as a constant reminder of failure and disappointment. The words had been harder to write than she had expected, each letter feeling like a small death. The mountain road had stretched before her in the early morning light, winding upward through stands of pine and aspen toward the high country where few people chose to make their homes. She had no destination in mind, only a desperate need to put distance between herself and the life that had crumbled around her. Her feet had carried her higher and higher, past the last of the valley farms and into the wilderness that crowned the peaks. By midday, exhaustion and grief had finally overwhelmed her. She had collapsed beside a small stream, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to tear themselves from some deep well of pain. The sound had echoed off the surrounding rocks, a keening wail that spoke of loss beyond words. She had cried until no more tears would come, until she was empty of everything except the hollow ache where her hope used to live. That was where Timothy Lee had found her. The mountain man had emerged from the forest like something out of a fairy tale, tall and broad-shouldered, with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes like winter sky. He had approached slowly, his hands visible and empty, his movements careful as if she were a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden gesture. When he spoke, his voice had been gentle despite his imposing presence. "You're a long way from anywhere," he had said, settling onto a fallen log a respectful distance away. "And you look like you've been traveling hard." Rachel had tried to compose herself to summon some dignity from the wreckage of her pride, but the effort had been beyond her. She had simply looked at him with red-rimmed eyes and waited for the judgment that seemed to follow her everywhere now. Instead, he had offered her water from his canteen and a piece of dried meat from his pack. "My name's Timothy," he had said. "Timothy Lee. I live up the mountain a ways. You're welcome to rest there if you need to." The offer had been made without conditions or expectations, a simple act of human kindness that had nearly broken her all over again. She had been so accustomed to love with strings attached, to acceptance that came with a price, that his unconditional generosity had seemed almost incomprehensible. "I don't have anywhere else to go, Tano," she had admitted, the words scraping her throat raw. "I left my husband, I lost our baby, and he couldn't forgive me for it." Timothy had been quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying her face with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable but somehow didn't. "A man who blames a woman for such grief isn't much of a man," he had said finally. "And any family that would turn out their own in a time of sorrow isn't much of a family." The simple validation had meant more to her than elaborate speeches of sympathy from him. Here was someone who understood instinctively that she was the victim of her circumstances, not their architect. For the first time in weeks, she had felt like a human being rather than a walking symbol of failure. The walk to his cabin had taken the better part of the afternoon, winding through dense forest and across rocky meadows where wildflowers still bloomed despite the approaching autumn. Timothy had matched his pace to hers, never rushing or showing impatience when she needed to rest. He had pointed out landmarks along the way, sharing the names of peaks and valleys with the casual familiarity of someone who had made this wilderness his home. His cabin, when it finally came into view, had taken her breath away. It sat in a natural clearing surrounded by towering pines, its log walls golden in the afternoon sunlight. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and a small garden flourished beside the front door. Everything about the place spoke of careful attention and quiet pride, of a man who had built himself a life of deliberate simplicity and found contentment in it. "It's not much," Timothy had said, following her gaze, "but it's solid and warm. You're welcome to stay as long as you need to." That had been 6 months ago. 6 months of healing in ways she hadn't known she needed to heal, of discovering strength she hadn't known she possessed. Timothy had asked nothing of her except that she help with the daily tasks that kept them both fed and sheltered. He had never pressed her for details about her past, never demanded explanations or justifications for her presence in his life. Instead, he had simply made room for her, adjusting his routines to accommodate another person without making her feel like a burden. He had shown her which plants in the forest were edible, which streams ran clearest, how to read the weather in the behavior of birds and the color of the sky. Gradually, she had begun to feel useful again, valuable for something other than her ability to bear children. The attraction between them had grown slowly, like a plant reaching towards sunlight. It had started with shared glances across the dinner table, progressed to hands that lingered when passing objects back and forth, evolved into conversations that stretched long into the evening hours. Rachel had found herself noticing the way Timothy's eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle strength of his hands as he worked, the patient kindness that seemed to inform his every action. When they had finally come together, it had been with a tenderness that made her previous marriage seem like a pale imitation of love. Timothy had touched her as if she were precious, as if her body were a gift to be treasured rather than a vessel to be used. He had whispered her name like a prayer and held her afterward as if she might disappear with the dawn. But even their love had not been enough to erase the fear that lived in her heart. Each month that passed without the signs of new life brought fresh waves of anxiety. What if Nicholas had been right? What if she was broken in some fundamental way, incapable of carrying a child to term? What if she brought Timothy nothing but disappointment and sorrow? The cradle had appeared in the cabin's corner 3 months ago, on a morning when Rachel had woken to find Timothy already gone from their bed. She had followed the sound of his tools to the small workshop he had built behind the cabin, where she had found him bent over a piece of maple, his hands moving with the precision of a master craftsman. Wood shavings littered the ground around his feet, and his face wore the expression of deep concentration she had come to love. "What are you making?" she had asked, though her heart had already guessed the answer. He had looked up at her with eyes full of quiet certainty. "Something we're going to need," he had said simply, "sooner or later." The confidence in his voice had made her chest tight with a mixture of hope and terror. He had continued working on the cradle for weeks, carving each spindle by hand, fitting each joint with painstaking care. She had watched him sand the wood until it was smooth as silk, had seen him apply coat after coat of beeswax until it gleamed like honey in the sunlight. When he had finally carried it into the cabin and placed it in the corner near their bed, she had been unable to speak. The cradle was beautiful beyond words, a masterpiece of craftsmanship and love, but it was also a monument to expectations she wasn't sure she could fulfill, a constant reminder of the ways she had already failed. "Timothy," she had whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "What if I can't give you children? What if I'm not able to fill this?" He had taken her hands in his calloused palms warm against her skin. "Then we'll have a beautiful piece of furniture," he had said, his voice gentle but firm. "But I don't believe that's how this story ends." His faith had been both comforting and terrifying. Rachel had wanted desperately to share his confidence, to believe that love and hope could overcome the failures of her past. But the memory of blood on white sheets, of Nicholas's disgusted face, of Gloria Brown's cutting words, lived in her body like a poison that no amount of mountain air could cleanse. Now, standing beside the empty cradle in the firelight, she felt the weight of those memories pressing against her chest. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in pristine white, erasing the scars and imperfections of the landscape. If only human healing could be so simple, she thought. If only the past could be covered over and forgotten as easily as the earth beneath winter's first snow. Timothy's hand found hers on the cradle rail, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said softly. Rachel closed her eyes and tried to find words for the tangle of emotions that lived inside her chest. "I'm thinking about time," she said finally, "about how much of it I've already wasted on fear, about how much more I might waste if I can't find a way to believe in tomorrow." "Fear's not waste," Timothy replied, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "Fear's just love, wearing a different face. You're afraid because you care so much it feels like it might break you open." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She had been so focused on her fear of failure that she had forgotten to acknowledge the love that lived beneath it. She was afraid because she wanted so desperately to give Timothy the family he deserved, to prove that she was worthy of the faith he had placed in her. "I lost a baby before," Timothy said quietly, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. "Long time ago, with a woman I thought I'd spend my life with. She blamed me for not being there when it happened, said if I'd been a better provider, she wouldn't have had to work so hard while she was carrying. Maybe she was right. Maybe I failed them both." Rachel turned to stare at him, shocked by this revelation. In all their months together, he had never spoken of a previous love, never hinted at such profound loss in his past. "What happened to her?" "She left," Timothy said simply. "Went back to her family in the valley, married a man who could give her the life she wanted. I came up here to lick my wounds and ended up staying." That was 15 years ago. The parallel to her own story was so striking it made her dizzy. "And you never tried to find someone else?" Timothy was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the crackling fire. "I told myself I was better off alone. Safer, less chance of failing someone again." He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Then you stumbled into my clearing, broken and beautiful and brave as hell, and I realized I'd been lying to myself for 15 years. The confession hung between them like a bridge spanning a chasm, connecting their separate sorrows into something larger and more meaningful. Rachel felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of shame and fear that had lived there for so long. She was not alone in her grief, not unique in her failure. Timothy understood her pain because he had walked this path before, had survived the loss of dreams, and emerged on the other side, still capable of love. Why didn't you tell me before? She asked, her voice soft with wonder. Same reason you don't talk much about your husband, Timothy replied. Some wounds need time to heal before they can bear the weight of words. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving the snow against the windows in rhythmic waves that sounded like distant applause. The cabin felt even more like a sanctuary now, a place where broken people could speak their truths without fear of judgment or rejection. Rachel found herself thinking about the strange paths that had led them both to this moment, the series of losses and failures that had ultimately brought them together. Do you think we're meant to wait together? She asked, the question emerging from some deep place she hadn't known existed. Or are we just two damaged people clinging to each other because we're afraid to be alone? Timothy considered this with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. Maybe it doesn't matter, he said finally. Maybe the reason matters less than what we choose to do with the time we have. The wisdom in his words struck her like a bell, clear and resonant. She had spent so much energy trying to understand why her first marriage had failed, why she had lost her baby, why her family had turned their backs on her. But perhaps the why mattered less than the what now, less than the choice to build something new from the pieces of what had been broken. I want to try again, she said, the words emerging before she had fully formed the thought. With you, I want to fill this cradle. Timothy's face softened, and she saw something that might have been relief flicker across his features. Are you sure? There's no guarantee it will work out any differently this time. Nothing's guaranteed, Rachel replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. But I'd rather fail trying than succeed at giving up. He lifted their joined hands to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Then we'll try, he said simply. Together. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and possibility. Together. It was such a simple concept, but it felt revolutionary after months of carrying her fears and hopes in solitude. Whatever came next, she would not face it alone. Whatever challenges arose, they would meet them as partners, as allies in the long war against despair. The fire had burned low while they talked, the flames settling into steady orange tongues that licked at the remaining logs. Timothy released her hand and moved to add fresh wood to the hearth, his movements economical and practiced. The new logs caught quickly, sending fresh light dancing across the cabin walls and chasing the shadows back into their corners. Rachel remained by the cradle, her fingers still tracing the smooth wood, but now the gesture felt different. Instead of mourning what was absent, she found herself imagining what might be. A small head resting against the soft pillow Timothy had stuffed with down from wild geese, tiny fingers grasping at the mobile he had carved from pine branches and painted with bright colors. The sound of contented breathing filling the quiet spaces of their mountain home. Spring's still months away, Timothy said, settling back beside her all. But when it comes, we should plant a garden, a bigger one, vegetables and herbs, maybe some flowers for the table. The suggestion was casual, but Rachel heard the deeper meaning beneath the words. He was planning for a future that included her, imagining seasons they would share, work they would do together. It was a gift, this assumption of continuity, this faith that their story would continue beyond the present moment. I'd like that, she said, and meant it. I've always wanted to grow my own herbs, lavender and rosemary, maybe some chamomile for tea. Chamomile's good for settling nerves, Timothy agreed, and lavender helps with sleep. We'll need both, I expect, once we have a little one keeping us awake at night. The easy confidence with which he spoke of their future child made Rachel's heart skip. He talked as if it were a foregone conclusion, as if the only question was when, not if. Part of her wanted to caution him against such certainty, to remind him that hope could be a dangerous thing. But a larger part of her was hungry for his faith, desperate to borrow some of his conviction until she could find her own. The conversation turned to practical matters then, the everyday details that would shape their life together. Timothy spoke of improvements he wanted to make to the cabin before winter settled in completely, of repairs to the roof and additions to their food stores. Rachel found herself contributing ideas, suggesting changes that would make the space more comfortable for both of them. It felt good to plan, to think beyond the immediate moment towards a future they would build together. As the evening wore on, they moved naturally into their established routines. Timothy banked the fire while Rachel prepared their simple supper of venison stew and day-old bread. They ate by lamplight, the conversation flowing easily between them, touching on everything from the behavior of the local wildlife to the books Timothy had collected over his years of solitude. It was only when they were preparing for bed that Rachel felt the familiar flutter of nervousness in her stomach. Making love with Timothy had always been a source of joy and connection, but now it carried additional weight. Now it was not just an expression of love, but an act of hope, a deliberate choice to trust in the possibility of new life. Timothy seemed to sense her anxiety as they settled beneath the heavy quilts he had sewn from scraps of wool and cotton. His touch was gentle as he drew her against his chest, his hand stroking her hair with infinite patience. "We don't have to," he whispered against her temple. "Not tonight, not until you're ready." But Rachel found that she was ready, more ready than she had been for anything in months. The fear was still there, coiled in her chest like a sleeping snake. But it was balanced now by something stronger. Hope, yes, but more than that, trust. Trust in Timothy's love, in her own resilience, in the possibility that sometimes broken things could be mended into something even more beautiful than they had been before. She turned in his arms and kissed him, pouring all of her newfound determination into the contact. He responded with the gentle passion she had come to love, his hands mapping the familiar territory of her body with reverent care. When they came together, it was with a tenderness that transcended the physical, a joining of spirits as much as bodies. Afterward, they lay entwined in the darkness, listening to the wind sing through the pine trees outside their window. Rachel felt different somehow, as if something fundamental had shifted inside her during their lovemaking. She couldn't say whether it was the beginning of new life or simply the beginning of new hope, but either way it felt like a gift. "Timothy," she whispered into the darkness. "Hmm? Thank you. For what?" She was quiet for a moment, trying to find words for the gratitude that filled her chest. "For seeing me, friend," she said finally. "For seeing who I really am instead of what I've failed to be." His arms tightened around her, and she felt his lips brush against her hair. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known," he said softly, "and the bravest. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." The words settled into her heart like seeds in fertile soil, taking root in places that had been barren for too long. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to imagine a future where his faith in her was justified, where the cradle in the corner would fulfill its purpose, where their love would bear fruit in more ways than one. Sleep came easily that night, deep and dreamless, the kind of rest that comes only when the spirit has finally found peace. Rachel woke before dawn to find Timothy already stirring beside her, his body warm and solid against her back. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, leaving the world transformed beneath a blanket of pristine white. The morning brought a sense of new beginning that seemed to permeate everything. Even their simple breakfast of porridge and coffee felt celebratory, as if they were marking the start of something significant. Timothy hummed while he worked, a tuneless melody that spoke of contentment, while Rachel found herself smiling for no particular reason, except that the world seemed full of possibility. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. Their daily routines remained largely unchanged, but everything was colored now by the shared hope they carried between them. Timothy continued his preparations for winter, checking and rechecking their supplies of food and fuel, while Rachel threw herself into the domestic tasks that made their cabin a home. She found herself paying closer attention to her body, noting every small change and variation with an intensity that would have embarrassed her before. Was that tenderness in her breast significant, or merely the result of cold weather and rough wool? Did the slight queasiness she felt some mornings mean something, or was it simply anxiety manifesting in physical form? Timothy, with his characteristic sensitivity, seemed to understand her heightened awareness without needing explanation. He began bringing her small gifts from his daily travels, a particularly beautiful pine cone, a piece of quartz that caught the light like captured sunshine, wildflowers that had somehow survived the early frost. Each offering was presented without fanfare, as if such gestures were the most natural thing in the world. 3 weeks after their conversation by the cradle, Rachel woke to a familiar cramping sensation low in her abdomen. Her heart sank as she recognized the harbinger of her monthly bleeding, the biological confirmation that once again, hope had been premature. She lay still in the pre-dawn darkness, fighting back tears of disappointment. Timothy stirred beside her, instantly alert to her distress. "What is it?" he asked softly. "Nothing," she whispered, but her voice betrayed her. "Just my body reminding me not to hope too hard." He gathered her against his chest without another word, his hands stroking her back with gentle persistence. They lay together in silence as the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows, neither of them speaking the disappointment that filled the space between them. "It's only been a few weeks," Timothy said finally. "These things take time." Rachel nodded against his chest, but privately she wondered if time would make any difference. Perhaps Nicholas had been right after all. Perhaps she was simply not meant for motherhood, destined to disappoint any man who hoped to build a family with her. The dark thoughts circled in her mind like carrion birds, picking at her newfound confidence until it felt as fragile as tissue paper. She tried to push them away, to focus on Timothy's steady heartbeat beneath her ear, but the familiar weight of failure pressed down on her chest like a stone. "Hey," Timothy said, tilting her chin up so he could see her face. "I know what you're thinking, and you need to stop." "You don't know what I'm thinking," Rachel protested weakly. "You're thinking this is your fault somehow," he said with quiet certainty. "You're thinking you failed me, failed us. You're thinking maybe you're broken in some way that can't be fixed." The accuracy of his assessment made her chest tight. "Aren't you disappointed?" "Of course I'm disappointed," Timothy admitted. "I want a family with you more than I've ever wanted anything. But disappointment isn't the same as blame, and it sure as hell isn't the same as giving up." His words were like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. Rachel grasped them desperately, using them to pull herself back from the edge of despair. "How do you stay so positive?" she asked. "Practice," Timothy said simply. 15 years of practice learning that hope is a choice you make every day, not a feeling that comes and goes with circumstances. The wisdom in his words struck her like a bell. She had been treating hope like a fragile thing, something that could be shattered by disappointment and had to be carefully protected. But Timothy was suggesting something different, that hope was a muscle that grew stronger with use, a discipline that could be cultivated regardless of external circumstances. "Teach me," she said, the words emerging from some deep place of longing. "Teach me how to hope like that." Timothy's response was to kiss her forehead with infinite tenderness. "First lesson," he said softly, "hope isn't about believing everything will work out the way you want. It's about believing that no matter what happens, you'll find a way to keep going." Over the following weeks, he demonstrated this philosophy in countless small ways. When a late-season storm damaged part of their roof, he didn't curse the weather or bemoan their bad luck. Instead, he simply gathered his tools and set about making repairs, whistling softly as he worked. When their supply of preserved meat ran lower than expected, he didn't worry about the long winter ahead. Instead, he took his rifle and spent a day hunting, returning with a young elk that would feed them for weeks. Rachel began to understand that Timothy's optimism wasn't naive or unfounded. It was a deliberate choice, a way of engaging with the world that assumed solutions could be found and challenges could be overcome. It was hope as a practical matter rather than a sentimental one. She tried to apply this approach to her own situation, to view her body's rhythms as information rather than judgment. Each month that passed without conception was not a failure but simply data, a piece of the larger puzzle they were working to solve. Some puzzles took longer than others, required more patience and persistence. That didn't make them impossible, only challenging. Winter settled over the mountains with a finality that made their cabin feel like the last outpost of civilization. Snow piled high against the windows, and the world beyond their door became a monochrome landscape of white and gray. But inside, their life together continued to deepen and evolve, shaped by the intimate rhythms of shared solitude. They read to each other by firelight, taking turns with the small collection of books Timothy had accumulated over the years. They played cards and told stories, sharing memories from their separate pasts and dreams for their shared future. They made love with increasing tenderness and frequency, their bodies learning new languages of pleasure and connection. And slowly, gradually, Rachel began to feel a change in herself that had nothing to do with conception and everything to do with self-acceptance. The shame that had driven her from her first marriage began to lose its grip on her heart. The voice that whispered of failure and inadequacy grew quieter with each passing day. In its place, she began to hear something new, the sound of her own worth, independent of her ability to bear children. It was during the deepest part of winter, when the snow lay 6 feet deep and the world outside seemed locked in eternal sleep, that Rachel first noticed the subtle changes in her body that she had been hoping for. The tenderness in her breasts that didn't fade with her monthly cycle, the slight queasiness that visited her most mornings, gentle but persistent, the fatigue that seemed to settle into her bones like a welcome weight. She said nothing to Timothy at first, afraid to voice her suspicions, lest speaking them aloud somehow jinx their fragile possibility. Instead, she observed her body with the careful attention of a naturalist, noting each small change and variation, building a case for hope one symptom at a time. It was Timothy who finally broached the subject, his intuition as finely tuned as always to her emotional weather. They were sitting by the fire one evening in late February, the wind howling outside like a living thing, when he looked up from the harness he was mending and studied her face with thoughtful eyes. "You're glowing," he said simply. Rachel felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It's just the firelight." "No," Timothy said, setting aside his work and moving to sit beside her on the small sofa he had built from pine logs and stuffed with goose down. "It's something else, something that starts from the inside and works its way out." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and hope. Rachel felt her heart begin to race, not with fear this time, but with a kind of cautious joy that felt too precious to trust completely. She had been carrying her suspicions alone for weeks now, afraid to share them even with the man who had taught her to hope again. "I think," she said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper, "I might be with child." The words seemed to transform the very air in the cabin, charging it with electricity like the moment before a thunderstorm. Timothy went very still beside her, his breathing shallow and controlled, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile possibility she had just voiced. "How long have you suspected?" he asked, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "3 weeks, maybe 4," Rachel admitted. "I didn't want to say anything until I was more certain. I didn't want to get our hopes up if I was wrong." Timothy reached for her hands, his calloused palms warm against her suddenly cold fingers. "And now, are you more certain?" Rachel closed her eyes and took inventory of her body once more, cataloging the subtle changes that had been accumulating like snow on a windowsill. The missed monthly bleeding, the tenderness that seemed to radiate from her core, the way certain smells made her stomach lurch while others barely registered. All the signs she had learned to recognize during her first pregnancy, now returning like old friends bearing gifts. "Yes," she said, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "I think I am." The smile that spread across Timothy's face was like sunrise after the longest night, slow and warm and full of promise. He lifted her hands to his lips and kissed each knuckle with reverent care, as if she were made of something infinitely precious and fragile. "We're going to have a baby," he said, the words carrying the weight of wonder and disbelief. "We're actually going to have a baby." Rachel nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks now, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. For the first time since losing her first child, she allowed herself to fully embrace the possibility of new life, to imagine a future filled with small hands and sleepy sighs and all the beautiful chaos that came with raising a child. "Are you scared?" Timothy asked, his thumb wiping away her tears with gentle precision. "Terrified," Rachel admitted, "but also happy, happier than I thought I could be again." They sat together in the firelight, hands clasped, hearts full, while outside the wind continued its ancient song through the pine trees. The cradle waited in its corner, no longer a monument to unfulfilled hope, but a promise soon to be realized. Rachel found herself looking at it with new eyes, imagining it occupied by a small form wrapped in the quilts she would sew, rocked by the gentle motion Timothy would provide with his strong, careful hands. "We need to be careful," she said, practical concerns beginning to surface through her joy. "The first few months are the most dangerous." I can't lose another baby, Timothy. I don't think I could survive it. You won't, he said with quiet certainty. This time is different. You're stronger now, and you're not carrying this burden alone. We're in this together, remember? The words settled around her like a warm blanket, chasing away the chill of old fears and older sorrows. Together, they would face whatever challenges came, whatever obstacles arose, as partners united in love and hope and stubborn determination. The weeks that followed were a delicate balance of joy and caution, hope and fear. Rachel found herself moving through her days with a new awareness of her body and its precious cargo, avoiding heavy lifting and getting extra rest, eating the nourishing foods Timothy prepared with increasing creativity and care. He seemed to anticipate her needs before she was aware of them herself, appearing with ginger tea when morning sickness struck, or a warm blanket when she felt suddenly cold. Spring came early that year, arriving with a rush of melting snow and budding trees that seemed to mirror the new life growing inside Rachel's body. As the world around them awakened from winter's sleep, she felt herself awakening too, not just to motherhood, but to a deeper understanding of her own strength and resilience. The morning sickness that had plagued her early weeks gradually gave way to a sense of vital energy that made her feel more alive than she had in years. Her body was changing, growing round and full, and for the first time in her life, she found herself proud of those changes rather than ashamed of them. This was what her body was meant to do, she realized. Not just to carry a child, but to nurture and protect and sustain new life with fierce maternal devotion. Timothy watched over her with the dedication of a guardian angel, but he was careful not to treat her like an invalid. He encouraged her to maintain her own daily routines, to continue the work that gave her purpose and satisfaction, while making subtle adjustments to accommodate her changing needs. When she grew tired, he suggested rest. When she grew restless, he proposed gentle walks through the awakening forest. As summer approached and her pregnancy became more visible, Rachel found herself thinking often about the family that had rejected her, the husband who had blamed her for circumstances beyond her control. She wondered if Nicholas ever thought about her, if he regretted his harsh words and hasty judgment. She wondered if Gloria Brown had ever questioned her cruel pronouncements about God's will and divine punishment. But these thoughts no longer carried the sting they once had. She had found something better than vindication in Timothy's love and acceptance. She had found herself, whole and worthy and strong, capable of creating life and nurturing it with fierce protective devotion. The garden they planted that spring flourished beyond their wildest expectations, as if the earth itself was celebrating the new life growing in Rachel's womb. Tomatoes swelled fat and red on their vines, beans climbed toward the sky with determined vigor, and the herbs Rachel had dreamed of filled the air with their fragrant promise. She spent hours tending the plants, her hands deep in the rich soil, feeling connected to the ancient rhythms of growth and harvest that had sustained humanity since the beginning of time. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountain peaks, Timothy reached over and placed his hand on Rachel's rounded belly. The baby responded immediately, a strong kick that made both of them laugh with delight. Active little one, Timothy observed, his voice full of wonder. Takes after his mother. Or her father, Rachel replied, covering his hand with hers. Remember, we don't know if it's a boy or girl yet. Doesn't matter to me, Timothy said, and she could hear the truth of it in his voice. As long as the baby is healthy and you're both safe, I'll be the happiest man in these mountains. The simplicity of his desires moved her almost to tears. He asked for so little, this man who had given her everything, health and safety, love and acceptance, a chance to start over and build something beautiful from the ashes of her former life. She had found in him not just a lover and partner, but a true companion of the soul, someone who saw her clearly and loved her completely, flaws and all. As autumn painted the mountainsides in shades of gold and crimson, Rachel felt the first stirrings of labor pains. They came gently at first, like whispers of the intensity to come, giving her time to prepare mentally and emotionally for the challenge ahead. Timothy had spent weeks gathering supplies and consulting with the few women in the nearest settlement who had experience with childbirth, determined to be as ready as possible for this moment. The labor lasted through the night and into the following day, a marathon of endurance that tested every reserve of strength Rachel possessed. Timothy never left her side, offering water when she was thirsty, cool cloths when she was feverish, words of encouragement when her courage began to falter. He was her anchor in the storm of pain, her steady presence in a world that seemed to consist of nothing but waves of sensation that threatened to overwhelm her completely. When their daughter finally arrived, slippery and perfect and screaming with indignant life, Rachel felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. All the fear and doubt that had plagued her for so long simply evaporated, replaced by a fierce maternal love that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. This tiny person, red-faced and furious at being expelled from her warm haven, was theirs. Theirs to love and protect and guide through all the loss and sorrows that lay ahead. "She's perfect," Timothy whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he cradled his daughter for the first time. "Absolutely perfect." Rachel could only nod, too overwhelmed with gratitude and exhaustion to speak. She watched through tears of joy as Timothy placed their child in the cradle he had built with such love and hope, the cradle that was no longer empty but fulfilled at last. The baby settled into the soft bedding with a contented sigh, as if she recognized the love that had gone into every carved spindle and carefully fitted joint. In the days that followed, their cabin filled with the sounds and rhythms of new life, crying and feeding, sleeping and waking. The endless cycle of care that bound parent to child with invisible but unbreakable threads. Rachel found herself transformed by motherhood, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually, as if becoming a mother had unlocked parts of herself she hadn't known existed. Timothy proved to be a devoted father, rising in the night to walk the floor with their daughter when she was fussy, singing to her in his rough but gentle voice, teaching her the names of birds and trees, even though she was far too young to understand. He approached fatherhood with the same patient dedication he brought to everything else, as if raising a child was simply another skill to be mastered through careful attention and persistent effort. They named her Sarah, after Timothy's grandmother, a woman he remembered as strong and kind and endlessly patient with the children in her care. The name seemed to fit their daughter perfectly, suggesting both strength and grace, qualities Rachel hoped the child would carry with her throughout her life. As winter settled over the mountains once again, their small family found its rhythm in the warm sanctuary of their cabin. The cradle rocked gently beside their bed, its precious cargo sleeping peacefully while snow fell outside the windows. Rachel would lie awake sometimes in the early morning hours, listening to her daughter's soft breathing and marveling at the journey that had brought them all to this moment. She thought often of the woman she had been a year ago, broken and despairing, convinced that she was fundamentally flawed in some irreparable way. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone she had known long ago but could barely remember. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had learned that hope was not a luxury but a necessity, not a feeling but a choice that had to be made fresh each day. The cradle that Timothy had built with such faith and love was no longer a symbol of unfulfilled dreams, but a testament to the power of patient hope and stubborn love. It held not just their daughter, but all the possibilities that stretched ahead of them, all the birthdays and bedtime stories and scraped knees and proud moments that would fill the years to come. On quiet evenings, when Sarah was sleeping and the fire burned low in the hearth, Rachel would sometimes catch Timothy looking at her with an expression of wonder that took her breath away. In those moments, she understood that their love story was not just about overcoming loss and finding each other, but about learning to trust in the future, even when the past had taught them that hope could be dangerous. The mountain man had built her a cradle, yes, but more than that, he had built her a life worth living, a love worth trusting, a future worth believing in. Together they had created not just a child, but a family, not just a home, but a sanctuary where broken people could heal and wounded hearts could learn to hope again. And in the gentle rocking of that hand-carved cradle, in the soft sighs of their sleeping daughter, in the steady rhythm of their shared breathing, Rachel heard the sound of dreams coming true at last.